Seaweed's remarkable range of uses has been proven out on smaller scale, but growing seaweed in open ocean has been difficult to imagine, let alone pilot and finance. Next slide, please. Our scope in this sprint covers 3 questions. What does growing seaweed at scale for climate impact mean? What technological solutions are being imagined, and how might they overcome key challenges in a high energy environment where they're constantly exposed to wind, waves, and storms? And finally, related challenges to environmental risk, social considerations, and governance. Next slide, please. We focused on 2 regions, the Gulf of Mexico, which provides the opportunity to restore dead regions due to anthropogenic nutrient pollution and eutrophication. It also has access to existing coastal infrastructures for growing, transportation, processing, markets, and CCS. And it's estimated there's about 63,000 square kilometers suitable for native seaweed growing in that area, and you can see it shaded in dark green on the slide. We also looked at the North American Eastern Seaboard because of its history in growing seaweed in Maine, New Hampshire, and Nova Scotia. And there are proven fast-growing cold water species, in particular Saccharina lactissima and Alaria esculenta. Next slide, please.
So our first question, big question to answer was just scaling issue in terms of whether there's enough surface area in the global ocean to grow seaweed at scale that would have climate relevant impacts. And we started with literature research, bumped into this really nice study, recent study that basically looked at 2 main constraints for seaweed growing: optimal nutrient ratio and suitable water temperature. And they've concluded there's roughly 48 million square kilometers available to grow seaweed in the global ocean. As you can see, a lot of them are in the open sea, the locations that we were interested in this sprint. Also, we did a very rough high-level calculation just to get a sense whether this area, when contrasted with typical seaweed productivity, typically expressed as tons of dry weight of biomass per square kilometer per year, whether that kind of gets to the scales that are needed, and what kind of scales we could achieve based on, again, rough calculations. Approximately 600,000 square kilometers are needed to capture 1 gigaton of carbon on an annual basis. We also looked at kind of IPCC projections in their under 1.5 Celsius warming scenarios, and the amounts that are kind of projected to be captured and removed by the end of the century. Again, based on these rough calculations, we see that between 2,000 in a lower case and 2 million in the higher case square kilometers would be needed. And compared to that previous slide, that amounts to 0.4 to 4.2% of the total area in the global ocean that is suitable to grow seaweed. In summary, theoretically, there's more than enough surface area to achieve the scales needed. But then obviously there's other constraints that have to be considered rather than just a simple area by biomass calculation. One of the major ones is environmental impacts, unintended consequences when you grow seaweed at these large scales. So some of the issues that are identified are issue of diverting nutrients away from existing wild food webs. Seaweed farms also alter local hydrodynamics. They can be source of invasive or pest species and diseases, and affect or alter the native biodiversity. But all this can be avoided or mitigated by careful and smart marine spatial planning, design and monitoring of the farms, and species selections. But the implication here is obviously that these theoretical numbers that I calculated in previous 2 slides are only tentative, and we have to consider multiple and complex constraints that would reduce these areas quite substantially, probably.
Yes, moving on to, so seaweed farming. So to lower the cost of seaweed farming, which is the most important challenge to achieve economic sustainability and to pay for this with income and profit. So to make this happen, we basically need economies of scale. We need standardization. In other words, it's always cheap to manufacture something in mass that is identical. So this infographic is basically one self-contained seaweed farm example. So imagine this as one circular cell with up to 1 kilometer in diameter, with windmill in the center and seaweed all around it. And then multiply these cells as many as one requires over time, from thousands to maybe up to even 1 million of these at larger scales. And this will work basically everywhere. High seas, coasts near equator, middle of Pacific, near Alaska, especially ocean deserts to reseed with life and so on. And you also see permaculture there. So we believe that permaculture, growing fish and seafood will most likely pay more than seaweed even. So going into more detail, we see a growing platform there for seaweed. It must also survive in the open ocean, waves, wind, storms, hurricanes, even icebergs. And big debate there was whether to build it from bamboo or fiberglass with stainless steel cables or with different high density polymers. At this scale, we decided to drop bamboo because that might have other environmental effects, even if we could grow it at such large scales. And again, this isn't very dependent on seaweed type, giant kelp, sugar kelp, everything goes. We also decided to have a single anchor, even if the sea would be kilometers deep, just to avoid basically cascading failures. But you see thrusters in the buoys and windmill because it has some local movement to like move away from sea icebergs and so on. Then nutrients, so how to access nutrients in for example, ocean desert areas. We ruled out ocean fertilization and natural upwelling quite early for various reasons, and we were left with artificial upwelling, which is basically pumping deep ocean water with big pipes versus depth cycling, which is lowering kelp to about 100 meters deep for the nights. And we went with depth cycling, which also gives safety during storms and probably saves us lots of environmental issues at such large scales. Then electrical power, it probably has to be a mix of floating solar and floating wind together with floating batteries. Depending on location, you can like have a different mix of these, but they both have to be planned in. Going on to, we need monitoring. So we have small robotic submarines, satellite monitoring, and also some cameras on top of the windmill, satellite communications, and also the robotic submarines would charge near the bases, and also the base stations are like safe havens during storms. And then we also need electric ships for harvesting, drying, and pre-processing on board, and also transportation to land. And yeah, back to you, Gina.
Okay, next slide, please. So growing seaweed at scale is obviously an expensive proposition, so it makes sense to look for synergies for things like infrastructure, servicing, and different revenue sources. Integrated multi-trophic aquaculture or permaculture is an example of this, where you can combine seaweed, finfish, shellfish on one farm for symbiotic benefit. It is a good opportunity to diversify revenue, and there are good examples out there. You can combine seaweed with renewable energy, in particular offshore wind power, and there are great examples in Germany and Netherlands. And interestingly, the Biden administration announced last week that they're exploring a 600 megawatt offshore wind project in the Gulf that could come online as early as 2030. So that's interesting. And then in oil and gas, there are oil rigs and other valuable assets that could be repurposed in the future as an anchor point or as processing stations for something like BECCS, which could be combined with CCS. I also want to just mention briefly the Mariner program, Department of Energy, that's committed to innovation in this area. They've committed 25 million for innovative projects to reduce the cost of growing seaweed at scale. Next slide, please. Public perception plays a significant role for the ability to pilot and fund and deploy ocean-based climate solutions. The important determinants here for acceptance are the degree to which the solution is perceived as natural, controllable, permanent, beneficial for the local communities, and for broader climate goals. You have to figure out early on who the stakeholders are, be specific, figure out their goals, their needs, concerns, and what scales are important to consider for them. Next slide, please. And there are governance challenges, mainly because there's no explicit legal framework for ocean CDR. But one of the most important determinants is where is the activity taking place? Is it state and territorial waters? Is it in the EEZ or at high seas? Because there's a patchwork of international, national state laws that are potentially applicable to these projects. And there are few case laws to guide. I've listed a few of the international laws that could apply. And in the US, there's a tangle of federal and state regulations relating to environment, wildlife and habitat, coastal impacts, pollution and dumping. And then beyond these laws, there are non-binding codes of conduct, like the Code of Conduct for Responsible Geoengineering Research, developed by UN Scientific Advisory Group on Marine Protection. So there are many complicating factors in governance. And I think I'll end there, and thank you.